Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I stamp Christmas images onto fabric and color them in with crayons. These are perfect little ornaments that you can use on your tree as gift tags or even tucked inside a fabric journal, and that's what I love to do with them. Because I'm choosing the colors and the images from my stamp collection, it becomes unique and personal to me. So let's get started creating this little technique. So to stamp Christmas images onto fabric and then color them in with crayons, you can get a cute little result. It makes a great tag. Here's a bit that I'm using in a page in a fabric journal. It's just a little accessory, but you can make that whole page colored in. Here's another few examples of how I stamped on fabric and colored them in with crayons, and you get just a rough result. It's kind of rustic, but it's very fun, and it's permanent. More or less, it will fade with laundering, but because I'm using it in a fabric book, it's not a problem for me. So let me show you the process and the different materials that I stamp on. So in today's video, I'm going to stamp on this Aida cloth. It's very textured. It's like a weave here. It's for cross stitching. It's a beautiful fabric. It produces a different result because of that texture. So you'll want to use this with larger stamped images, not really intricate ones. Using just a piece of standard muslin, very lightweight, because I love that background. And then this is a heavier piece of muslin. And this one doesn't tend to fray like this. It's a lightweight canvas, really. So to prepare my fabric, I'm going to use an iron. So I have my wool heating mat ready to go here. The Aida cloth doesn't really need much preparation. You just want to make sure there are no wrinkles or folds in it. So to that end, I can just take a hot iron and just press over it to just make sure that it's nice and smooth. I'll do the same thing with any of my heavier weight muslin. But for my lighter weight muslin, I want to make sure that there are no wrinkles. Press that fabric. I like to do both sides. And then I'll either use a piece of sandpaper on the back so that when I'm coloring it in, the paper moves less. Or I'll use some freezer paper. In the United States, you find this in the grocery store. And it comes in a roll right by the plastic wrap. And it tears just like paper or cuts very nicely. Now one side is plastic and one side is paper. So I like to cut it down smaller than my piece of fabric. So I'll just make a little cut here. And you can see how it cuts beautifully. And then I take my fabric and set it right on top of my freezer paper, flip it over, and making sure that I'm ironing the paper side, not the plastic side, I just bring my iron on top of that freezer paper. The fabric adheres to the freezer paper temporarily, and then you have a nicer surface to color on and to stamp on. So you'll need to let this cool, it only takes a few seconds, and then we're ready to start stamping. You'll need your iron to heat set your fabric ink as well as your crayons, so don't put it away just yet, just set it aside for now. So now I have my stamped images here. I wouldn't use anything delicate, like these little images here on the Aida cloth, because it won't show up, but the larger images would show up pretty nicely. I'm going to use this one here, this gingerbread stamp, and all I do is I take it and attach it to an acrylic block, and that's the image that will stamp. I'm also going to use this image here of the car with a tree on top. But any of these larger images work beautifully for stamping on fabric. I have some others, some Santas, and I'll use that as well. Now to stamp on the Aida cloth and the muslin, you want just a little give underneath that area. Some people suggest a mouse pad. I like to just use a magazine. It has a little bit of give, but not a lot of give. I'll take my ink, this is for fabric in particular, and I'll just pounce it right on top of that stamp. And I think I have a nice coating of ink. I can then just stamp my fabric. I put it down, press, and then when I'm done pressing, I want to lift it straight up. And I get a very faint image on the Aida cloth. I can go over it again stamping a little further, trying to get a little more of an inked image. Let's see if I can improve that image. So that's a little bit better. Pretty good for coloring in. I'll do it one more time. And so third time's the charm. I'll stamp my other fabrics in the same way. I'll just take my ink up my stamp, and press it on the fabrics. And so then I have my image. I'll stamp a few images onto the fabric and show you the results. So after you stamp your images, clean your stamps with some baby wipes, and then you can set them aside. You won't be using them anymore. So now I stamped onto the Aida cloth different stamps, and I just take an iron, a hot iron for whatever temperature the fabric is. So if it's cotton fabric or linen, and I just go over about 5 to 10 seconds, and this heat sets the ink. You want to make sure the ink is dry before you do this. And I've done this on those images, and I'll just do it on this final image here. Now it lightens up the ink ever so slightly, but as you can see, all of my stamps are ready to be colored in now. And you can see the different textures of the fabric. So now to color in my images, I just use Crayola crayons. Those are my favorite. There are lots of variations, beeswax crayons, and so on. But for coloring it in, it's the same basic procedure. You'll want your crayons to be sharp so you get a nice image. And the larger boxes have a sharpener on the back. I also keep a little sharpener beside me. And then I'll just start to color in the images. Now on this one, I have my freezer paper on the back of one image, but not the other, because I want to just show you the difference. So when you're coloring it in, the fabric tends to move around. It's not quite like paper. But there are a couple of little techniques for coloring it in. If you know you're going to color in a certain area, like say this car, I want to color it blue. My father used to have a blue Volkswagen Beetle, so I tend to always color my Christmas cars in that color. So I go over the area I'm going to add crayon to with a white first. And that just creates a little base, fills in some of the texture, the weave of the fabric. Now you could see that when I was coloring in on this area where I have the lightweight muslin and the freezer paper, it was kind of a nice coloring procedure. The fabric pulled, and I tried to keep all my strokes going in one direction. Over here though, when I'm coloring it in on the fabric without the background, I tend to hold it in place, taut, with my fingers. If I don't, this is what the result. So I hold it taut. I tend to always go in the same direction, or at least up and down, side to side. And I just have to do a little more effort. So I find the freezer paper is really beneficial for that aspect of working with fabric, but it's not required. To get a nice depth of color, I like to use 3 shades of the same color. You can switch colors, you don't have to use all of the same color. But for example, on the car, I'm going to use blue. So I have 3 blues, a darker and medium and light. So I start with the light color, and I tend to go in the center. And again, I'm keeping all my strokes in the same direction, and I'm coloring right on top of that white that I put down. Now you could fill in all the areas that you want to be blue, so in this case it'll be all areas of the car, but I'm really focusing on those areas in the center of the car. I'll do a few strokes on the outside as well just to get a nice blend, but I like to fill in the center of the car, and then I'll do the same thing here with the area without the freezer paper. So from here I'll take my medium color, my medium shade of the blue, and just from the edges I'll work my way towards the center. Again, always trying to go with that same stroke, that same direction. And I'm filling it in about 80% of the way. I'm not trying to fill up all of the fabric with my color. Now I'll come from either end, but I'm leaving the center of my piece a little bit lighter. And then lastly, I'll come in with my darkest color. And just on the edges, maybe a quarter of the way in, I'll add some of that color. Now it's still a little bit unsmooth. It's still a little rough coming from the edges, but I want to put that color down first, leading towards the center, the lightest point. You could also choose to have it all going from one direction, so I could make the right side of the car, say, the darkest, and going to a gradient with the lightest at the rear end. But I like to have that gradient, that lighter area in the middle. And I'll do the same thing here. So now I have the beginnings of a nice gradient. I'll come back in with my lightest color, and I'm going to go over that center area where I first put down that color. And this achieves a nice gradient. I'll do the same thing on this car on the bottom, and I can come back in with the darker color and just fine tune the edges. And then the same thing with the medium color, just blending everything into that center of that car, which is where I chose to make it the lightest. So I'm pretty happy with how that came out. I want to do the same thing with that tree. I have my 3 greens, shamrock, forest, and inchworm. And I think the forest is going to be the darkest. So I'm going to start here, and just following the direction of that stamp, I'm just going to make strokes looking like the tree. Just at the base of the tree, maybe the bottom half. And I'll do that on both trees. Again, I'm not filling up the area entirely, just maybe 60 or 70% of it. Now I'm going to come back in with my shamrock, my medium color. I'm going to overlap and then bring it up to the top 2/3 with this color. And then I'll take the lightest color, that inchworm, and I'll go over the entire tree, paying special attention to the top. Now you can add additional colors as well. You don't have to be limited to 3, but I think 3 is a good starting point. So now from here, I'll come back in with the shamrock, add a few strokes over the lightest color, a few strokes over the darkest color, and just play around with it until I'm happy with the result. I'll add a few more colors here and there on the tree trunk, and maybe just going over that stripe with a darker color. Let's see how it looks when I'm done. So now looking at my tree, it looks a little flat, so I'm going to take a little bit of red, the opposite of green, and just go in with it and just add a few little strokes here and there. Again, they're going the direction that the stamped image goes, and I'm really happy with how that came out. Can do the same thing with my gingerbread man, and it's even easier with the Santa on the heavyweight muslin. But I want to show you what it's like to color on the Aida cloth. Again, I'll use that same image, that car. I'll use the same colors, and I'll start with the white. And because the Aida cloth is a little heavy, I can just hold my hand to hold it in place. It doesn't require the same tension that the muslin required. And I'll speed this along so you can watch the process. I'm using all the same colors. It just requires a little more effort because there's so much texture on the Aida cloth. It gives a different result. It's very pixelated, but I think it's quite lovely. I love the heaviness of the Aida cloth, and it takes the color just beautifully. And so there I have my images colored in using the blending method and the crayons. The next stage is to heat set all these images. So I'm going to finish coloring in my images, and then we'll heat set everything. So now I finished coloring in the images, and you can see the different textures on the fabric. We're not quite done yet. We're not quite ready to use these as tags or whatnot. We have to heat set that. And we also are trying to remove the wax from the crayon. So I'll show you how I do it on 2 images, on the Aida cloth and then on the muslin, and I'll do the rest off camera. Now there is a little bit of color fading when you do this technique, but it's required to get the wax off the crayon so that you're leaving the dye on your fabric. I just used some paper towels here, and I'm just going to set it over my image. And then with my hot iron, I'm just going to press and hold it down for maybe 10 seconds all over that image, maybe more. It depends on what the results are. Then I can just remove the fabric, and you can see a little bit of the wax comes off, and so does a little bit of the color. And you'll keep doing this until you don't get any more wax residue off of the crayon image and onto your paper towel. You want to make sure you protect your iron, and that's why you're using the paper towel. It absorbs the wax, and it protects the iron. So you only need to do this 2 or 3 times. Now, before I heat set it, I took a permanent marker and just went over some of the face features and the little dots just to give it more of definition, because they kind of came out being colored with the fabric. So now I'll do the same thing here. So now all my images have been heat set. I can remove the freezer wrap from the background. It's that easy. And now I have these images that I can use in my slow stitching. Now you can see the difference between the Aida cloth and the muslin. It's just a different look. I happen to really like this texture. And the same thing with the gingerbread. So it's just very fun to have all these images to use in your fabric, particularly if you're a rubber stamp collector. So that's how I make Christmas stamped images to use either on my tree, as gift tags, or inside a fabric journal. In the future, I'll have a video where we stitch through these little images, but this one is great just for a little flat ornament. You can even tuck it inside a little Christmas card. I think it's adorable. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.